Hey everybody, this is Greg again, and we are on the Contact Center KPI podcast. And with us today, we have Chris Crosby, founder and CEO of CX Ventures. Chris, please take a moment to say hi.
Hi, everybody. Great, Claire. Thanks for having me on today. Excited for our KPI chat.
And by KPI chat, you mean no KPI chat.
I mean, KPI less, yeah.
KPI lists. So for our listeners, traditionally we focused our time together on one KPI with each guest that we've had on. And when we were prepping with Chris, he kind of threw out this idea of like, hey, there is no real good or perfect KPI. And we were like, maybe let's dive into that a little bit more. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So Chris, before we go off on that rabbit hole that we're going to go deep in, please just give a little background on yourself, kind of industry, what you've worked on in the past. Kind of give us the synopsis of Chris Crosby.
Synopsis of Chris Crosby in 15 seconds,
Yeah.
more or less. So I've been in call centers since I was 16 and an outbound telemarketer in high school, and spent a good decade really operating and managing contact centers and then sort of the infrastructure around that, because I was the business ops guy that could speak geek, and so could translate the two, and then built a company that was, speaking of KPIs, really one of the first purpose-built business intelligence and analytics engines for call centers. And then we exited that company to Cisco Systems, which
Nice.
became the reporting engine across all other contacts in our portfolio. So if you fast forward to today, I actually operate two companies inside the space. One is a BPO. I came out of the BPO world. So we like to think of ourselves as really kind of leading the charge in AI-led contact center operations and services. So we're not going to be the BPO that comes to you and says, hey, we just want butts and seats and to bill you hours. Like, we really want to, our charter is to build the best run call center on the planet. That is by using our other company's technology, Exact, which is really the data and analytics infrastructure and conversational intelligence and AI wrapped around the contact center environment. And so we spent a lot of time digging through data, right, and applying that data in unique and interesting ways that kind of surface insights that are more actionable than what I would call kind of the traditional KPIs. And so my lens, when I approach conversations or really anything in the space, is coming from both the what's a VP of operations, call center manager, like what are they going to do? How can they execute on this stuff, right? Because they get a lot thrown at them on a daily basis, all the way through, well, how do we build better tools that aren't just buzzwords, or present to Slidewire, that can actually enable and empower the operators to achieve their mission of great customer experience at a reasonable cost of service.
Yeah, I love that. So you come at it from a different perspective than I think a lot of folks we talk to, because you've been on the software side where you've been tasked with building the software, and that gives you a different perspective than someone who's just utilizing the software, or trying to think about utilizing the software. And so when you were talking about, the best KPI is no KPI, it really got me thinking, because there's always a lens or a bias that we look at a certain KPI through as to why we want to use that KPI. It's something that either as a lagging indicator or a leading indicator, it's something that we can influence. And then we use that as a measure of success. And you go like, hey, look what I did, type of thing. So for folks though, like that are like, hey, there's no good KPI, like, great. Where do I start? Like, what do I measure myself against then if I need a way to measure myself to my boss?
Right. So maybe I'll step back and sort of give my lens on my viewpoint on why I don't think KPIs as they are today are really worth much beyond the dashboard. I built a BI company, and I still say dashboards are where good data goes to die. Because what do you get? You get a pretty picture with some blinking lights and some charts, and then you still have to discern what the hell you're going to do, right? Am I good, bad? Otherwise, The indicator's red. What's that mean?
Yeah. That's fair. Yep.
Well, and there, when you look, sit back and look at it, every KPI that is standard, call it standard in the industry, is an aggregation. It's an average. So anytime you look at an average, you're burying reality, and any average can be gamed, right? I mean, again, going back to my operations days, if you have a service level target to hit, inevitably what's going to happen is that between 9 and 10 a.m. in the morning, you're going to get slammed with calls. You're going to miss your service level for that 1 hour interval. And then you're going to overstaff the rest of the day so that you can make up your service level and not get fined by whatever regulatory body or client, has a noose around your neck to hit service level. Meanwhile, the customer experience, if you're at an 80-20 service level, your customer doesn't care. The caller doesn't care if they get answered in 19 seconds or 21 seconds, right? That experience is undifferentiated to them, but
That's
it
fair.
matters a lot to all your Erlang C calculations, to all your FTEs, everything downstream. That 2 seconds or 1 second on either side of that is going to impact it. And so that's really when I first started kind of falling out of love with KPIs, was that I'm like, this makes sense, right? But if you look at every KPI and start to peel it apart, right? So what I advocate is looking at the lowest common denominators. What are the things that are feeding into these KPIs? If you look at something like service level and you miss that, well, why is it? Was your forecast off? Was your forecast good, but your schedule adherence is off? Okay, if schedule adherence is off, why? Is it people not showing up at all? Is it you approved too much time off? Is it late breaks? And so you sort of always end up in this constant web of really trying to understand, why did this thing go off the rails? And you can do that with every single KPI. So if you take an average handle time, again, there's other inputs into average handle time. You get talk, after call work, hold, generally speaking, but also there's this distribution curve, right, along your agents, and you guys see this in what you do, right? You're going to have agents that are well above the average handle time, and you're going to have some that are below it. But just because they're above it, is that a bad thing? Maybe they're killing it from a sales conversion standpoint, and they're just on the phone longer.
Yeah.
That's a good thing. And you get the other people on the other end, and you're like, you got to get off the phone. And so they're moving efficiently, but not having the same impact. And so, again, coming back to really, I think, thinking about KPIs from maybe a slightly different view or contrarian view would be like, well, how can we just decompose all of those down into the actual individual building blocks? Look at the root core analysis across that. And then if you take something like schedule adherence, right, that's going to feed a lot of different things. If you got people late from break because nobody's watching it, nobody's holding your agents accountable, you're going to miss service level, you're going to miss your shrinkage, you're going to overpay people. And there's a whole lot of stuff that ends up going off the rails. And so what we end up doing, and I've actually got a chart, I can, if I can share my screen here in a minute to just kind of show you how we think about some of these roll-ups. Degradation is like, take whatever your North Star is, or whatever your CFO wants to see, or CEO, or whomever, decompose that into the building blocks, right? Lowest common denominators. I'll pause there and then going to come back and expand on it.
So in my sales career in a previous life, one of my favorite sayings was dashboards don't close deals, reps do. And you looked at all the metrics the dashboard would present, and those are lagging indicators of success. Those are things that happen as a result of the building blocks all being kind of put into place correctly up front in the first place. I think there's just a natural tendency to want to lean on dashboards because I can take a screenshot of it, export it as a PDF, and go, look how awesome I'm doing in my job, even though I'm failing at these other things that are more downstream, maybe leading indicators of success, like adherence, shrinkage, all those things that we care about that ultimately result in that average on my fancy dashboard.
Yeah.
So as a call center leader, right? Like, how do I, again, I'm going to ask the same question. How do I articulate those building blocks in a meaningful way to my team as to why I care about them, or to my boss as to why they matter, when across the board, all we're taught is this KPI, this KPI, this
Yeah.
KPI matters the most?
Yeah. Great question. I'm gonna make 3 points on this one. The first one is that any KPI can be gamed. We have clients, won't name any names, but like one of our healthcare clients, they get sanctioned by the state if they miss service level. And so what they end up doing is, if there's no agent available to answer the call, they end up sending the call to voicemail,
Okay.
and then they'll call them back because that doesn't impact their service level in an adverse way, right? So forget the customer experience. It's shitty, right? But you're making it worse by not addressing the underlying problem. But you're hitting your service level and you're not getting fined by the state or the regulatory body. So, and I would argue that plays out more than you maybe it's callbacks, or maybe it's you can game average handle time by not including hold time, or transfers or whatever. But so there's that, which is then, well, how do you get out of the gaming, right? And of KPIs, and everybody just sort of singularly focused on an outcome, one arbitrary outcome. And I think it comes down to what John Wooden, the basketball coach, said about shooting free throws. It's about the fundamentals, right? If you're focused on the fundamentals of your operation, the day-to-day, just practice and putting the ball in the basket, right? Around, are your people showing up on time? Are they handling the ball effectively and efficiently? Are they asking for upsells? Are they doing that in the way that's going to drive conversion? Are they, is your workforce management team putting out a forecast that's reasonably accurate?
Yeah.
It's about the fundamentals. And if you get those right, your KPIs are going to fall in line. And it's not going to be just one that falls in line. If they're calibrated right, they're all going to fall in line, right? But because again, they're all derivatives of the fundamentals, or they're different aggregations of the basics. Shoot the free throws, do it day in, day out. Coach your agents, monitor your agents, and you'll get there. And then but then that sort of begs the question. Then like, okay, that's great, but how do I know if that's being effective? And I think the third point is break these attributes into two categories. One, what the person that is responsible for it can control versus what they can influence, right? And then hold people accountable based on that. You can't hold the call center operations manager accountable for service level if they're not the ones generating the forecast, or that department doesn't report into them. You can hold the director of ops accountable for it if everything kind of ends up there, right?
Yeah.
But if they can't influence the schedule, you can't make that as a KPI in their success. But what you can is like, what can they control? They can reasonably control the quality of their agents, right? You're either coaching them and moving them along, or you're moving them out. So as you define the roles and responsibilities, into really a chart, you need to break out who's responsible for what versus what are they out ultimately influencing. And you can kind of think of this like as, tributaries, a bunch of streams rolling into a river, right? Ultimately your profitability or your customer experience index is that river that everything rolls into, but it's all starting upstream with what people can control and what they're dumping into the stream. It's either going to be good or you're going to poison the whole thing.
It's valid. I love that you brought up John Wooden earlier. I did a lot of research on him for a blog post a couple months ago, and it talked about, he coached Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Bill Walton, some pretty like loud personalities, and he got everybody to kind of buy in. And kind of, again, he did that by always bringing everything back to the fundamentals. And so I think it's just awesome that you used him as an example. And then to the responsibility piece versus authority, you can't hold somebody responsible for something if you don't give them the authority to influence what they're responsible for. And
Yeah.
so I thought I would agree with that as well. And so again, it goes back to the fundamentals. You know, are you coaching your agents? Are you on the front lines with your agents, or are you just shoving KPIs down their throat and not helping them understand why it matters, and what they can do to actually influence it positively? So I don't disagree with you on any of the points that you brought up, actually, which is, I think, a first. So
And I'll give you maybe, and I'm going to share, I don't know if the listeners will be able to see this, but this is sort of an example of a KPI map that I put together. So if we look at a pretty important, call it KPI or metric that people really don't sort of consider, it's your staffing capacity, right? So if we think about, well, what is our capacity to staff a call center? And you start working backwards to everything that's going to flow into that, you end up with multiple departments hitting things. Like you have your hiring capacity, right? Like everything ends up at some point coming back to, are you able to get the right people in the door and on the phones, right? Which starts usually in HR and talent acquisition. It starts in training, your onboarding, your training completion rates, your new hire fill rates. How long does it take you to hire somebody? How many applicants are you getting versus how many you're hiring? So
yeah,
if you're missing staffing, right, you can have a well-run operation, but if you ain't getting the right people through the door, you ain't gonna hit your number. And then once you get them through the door, we talked a bit about shrinkage. If we look down here, attendance goes into that, which is going to be your unplanned and planned absences. You're going to have your schedule adherence, which again, if you start breaking, and we could break these out even further, right? But this is
yeah,
really just hit the high points. And so what we do, and even agent development, right? Are you pulling people off the phones to coach 20 minutes a day? Are you pulling them 20 people at a time to do refresher training? Same thing with, if I scroll up here to retention, we focus a lot on predicting and forecasting attrition based off of a number of different variables, one of which is time on the phones. Like we know if somebody is with us, we know there's going to be fallout during training. You got to plan for that. But we know that if we get somebody on the phones for 90 days, they're going to be here 365 days, right? Nine
competently,
times.
like, yeah, okay,
But if you don't get them through, that 30-day mark, you got to understand all that. And then the other aspect too is now that we have this whole AI world, which I know you guys are thriving in right now too, it's what does that do to our staffing capacity? How are we going to measure the impact of an intelligent virtual agent or a bot or a fill in the blank on our customer experience and on our operations and on all these other metrics? And so what I would recommend is that folks, take the time to go through the things that they're being held accountable for, their targets. Walk backwards into what are the inputs. It's all about input and output. If you want a certain output, you got to make sure that the recipe and the ingredients are formulated right to get that cake baked right? So what all's going in, and then create that map. And by the way, we can take that map and we can light it up with real data flowing in, which is what we do. But not everybody has all the tools and capabilities to do that. But anybody, I think, can take the time to really walk into what are the fundamentals, what are the core aspects and tributaries going into this recipe, and how do you monitor those and dial those up and down. And again, everything downstream will improve or get worse based off the day to day.
I love that. So I want to end on that note, right? Because a lot of people walk into, maybe they're an agent, they get promoted into a manager or supervisor, and they're told, hey, you're going to focus on this KPI. and they don't ever take the time to think about all the things that lead into that. And so I think that would be, my big takeaway for us today would be, really kind of diagram out, to use your language, Chris, all the tributaries that kind of work their way into that river in which you are measured. And if you're not doing that, then, you can't really, be mad at yourself if you don't hit that KPI or you get held responsible for it. If you identify those things and ask for the authority to influence those things, then right, you should be held responsible for it. But it's almost one of those things, you don't know what you don't know. And I think a lot of agents get promoted into that frontline manager and then are like, all right, I'm just going to go basically try to recreate myself over and over again.
Yeah.
And they don't
And they're
think
set
about
up
all
to
the
fail,
things.
right? Because it's a different skill set. It's a different set of training and coaching that needs to occur. And sometimes it works out great and sometimes it doesn't, right? But and I think even to that point, Greg, is there's a different set of indicators around how somebody's doing their job as a coach versus or a supervisor versus an agent, right? And I'd recommend mapping that out by role as well.
I love it. Well, Chris, this has been awesome. I didn't really know what to expect heading into a conversation about KPIs where we weren't going to focus on KPIs, but it actually worked out pretty well. So I appreciate your perspective. And, again, I always learn something from this. And, I actually took away a lot. So I hope our listeners do as well, Chris. Thank you for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate you guys, taking the time to interview me, and then send me that blog post. I want to read that.
Yeah, I will. Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Hayes.
Bye.